Okay, we're 4 o'clock. We're only half here. You could put it that way, but anyway, I want to get started, and then we'll have the other half wander in as we're going through it. Now that as I said, the first 4 classes, we've been reviewing the specific logistical moment in which we find ourselves that is the election of 2016, in the larger tactical moment that we find ourselves in at the end of the Cold War. And I was saying this is all in the context of the larger strategic objective of the class, which is to make it clear that there's this ongoing strategic level dialectical contest going on in the United States between this elite governing class of about 1% of the population that actually feel entitled to make all the decisions for the country, both domestic and foreign policy, and then the other 99% of us who they consider to be sort of plebeians, or the great unwashed, often referred to as the governed. And I wanted to point out that the epitome of this 1% is a much tinier group of people that has actually been referred to in a famous quote by James Jesus Angleton, who was the chief of counterintelligence for the Central Intelligence Agency when he was appointed by Allen Dulles in 1953 to be the director of counterintelligence for the Central Intelligence Agency. Angleton later reported to Joe Trento, who was an author who wrote a book called Prelude to Terror, going through the background of this war on terror that we find ourselves in the midst of now. He quoted James Angleton as telling Trento that when Angleton was interviewed by Dulles about being the head of counterintelligence, that Dulles told him that the single condition on which he would agree to hire him would be that Angleton would have to agree not to polygraph either him, Allen Dulles, or any of the 60 men that he worked with to help fund Germany between World War I and World War II. And that this is the kind of group of people that we're talking about, is a group of men between like 50 and 60 in number who constitute this cabal, who actually reside in the shadows and actually call the shots with regard to American foreign policy and even domestic policy. But this is the context in which we were reviewing at the end of the last class the end of the Cold War and the situation that we found ourselves in there. And I began to I was talking about, there's a couple corrections I want to make when we looked at the tape. I referred to Osama being elected president of the United States, and he wasn't. That was Obama. And I referred to Saddam Hussein as a Shia, whereas in fact he's a Sunni. And the Sunnis and the Sunni-dominant government in Iraq was at war with Iran, who were Shias. That just I misspoke at that point. I just wanted to correct those things so you wouldn't go off saying, "Wait, what? I must be confused about that." But what I wanted to do is that I ended at the end of last Thursday. We were talking about this project for a new American century that arose at the end of the Cold War with this group inside the administration of George H.W. Bush, specifically inside the Defense Department under Richard Cheney, with Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz and Elliott Abrams and Bill Kristol and a lot of these others that were there at the time. As I was talking about them in the context of being part of this cabal. With Dick Cheney being the CEO of Halliburton, who ended up getting billions of dollars of contracts, no-bid contracts in the wars, and Paul Wolfowitz, who ended up being made the president of the World Bank. There's this cabal of individuals, Elliott Abrams, who ended up getting indicted by the special prosecutor for perjuring himself when he was denying the existence of this off-the-shelf enterprise to Congress, and also Scooter Libby, who showed up in these meetings over and over again, and he ended up getting indicted for disclosing the identity of Valerie Plame when he was trying to basically intimidate her husband, Ambassador Wilson, from saying that the position that was being taken by the W. Bush administration about the Iraqi government trying to purchase a yellow cake to build a nuclear weapon, which was untrue, and they knew it was untrue. And Scooter Libby tried to intimidate Ambassador Wilson by publicly revealing the fact that his wife, Valerie Plame, was a CIA agent and violated a federal statute which prohibits that. Anyway, I was in the process of talking about this group as kind of a modern incarnation of the cabal as part of them, and talked with you about such groups as the Carlyle Group and others that were analogous to, and I referred to Brown Brothers, Harriman, and Sullivan and Cromwell back in the 1920s and 30s. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to, again at the beginning of this class, I wanted to again point out that this type of group has been around for the whole period of the American nation state. And I wanted to read I've read a few quotations to you from Franklin Roosevelt and Wilson in the earlier classes, but there are a few more that I dug out. So just to try to make clear that when we're talking here about such a cabal, that this is not some type of kind of harebrained conspiracy theory. This has been recognized by presidents of the United States in public discourse for some time, and others. And one of the quotes here is from the Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, Major General Smedley Butler, who said upon his retirement, he said, "I spent 33 years in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for American big business, for Wall Street, and for their bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a safe place for the national bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of over a half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers in 1902, all the way to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American Fruit Company, United Fruit, in 1903. And in China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil was unmolested. Looking back upon it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. I was just a paid gun thug for Brown Brothers Harriman." Okay. Now this is the Commandant of the United States Marine Corps upon his retirement. And when you're looking to see what the mindset was of the people that he's talking about that were in this cabal, one of them, for example, that we'll touch on later is Cornelius Vanderbilt. And he's got a famous quote when he said, "What do I care about the law? I've got the power." And then another one of the robber barons, Jay Gould, said, I can hire half of the working class to kill the other half. These are and then there's the full-blown elucidation of the white man's burden, this concept they had along with manifest destiny, that it was somehow their God-given right as elitists, Caucasian elite capitalists, to basically commandeer all of the rest of the North American continent and to destroy the Native American people in their culture. Just as the Europeans, England had taken over, in India, and the Dutch, the Boers, had taken over in South Africa and others. And so there's a famous poem that you may have heard about by Rudyard Kipling that talks about the white man's burden. And this is what it says. Take up the white man's burden. Set forth the best of your breed. Go send your sons into exile to serve your captives' needs, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk in wild, your new-caught sullen people, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work for another's gain. Take up the white man's burden and reap your old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard, the cry of hosts ye humor, ah, slowly to the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days. The lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise, comes now to search your manhood through all the thankless years, cold-edged with dear-bought wisdom, the judgment of your peers. This is the concept that they had, that they would take up the heavy burden of doing all of the things that were necessary, even including bearing the criticism of others for their kind of royalist attitudes and their colonial ambitions, that somehow they were standing proud in the face of those kind of criticisms in bringing the control over the resources of the half-devils and half-children of the colonial powers. And these are some more quotes. This is another quote from Franklin Roosevelt in his book called Looking Forward in 1934. He was talking about in 1934 the rise to power of Hitler as the Chancellor of Germany. He says, the unhappy events that we are witnessing now abroad in the world, this is the rise of fascism throughout Europe, have retaught us two important simple truths about liberty of a democratic people. And he goes on to say, and he talks about the second truth. The second truth is that our liberty in a democracy is not safe if the economic system adopted by the nation's business class does not provide adequate employment and distribute goods and services in such a manner as to sustain an acceptable standard of living for all. And he simply states it flat out. And then he says, more striking still is that this process of the concentration of wealth in power goes on if in fact the concentration of wealth and power goes on at its present rate, by the end of this century, now he's talking in 1934, so he's saying basically by the end of the 20th century, in the beginning of the 21st century, in 2001, we shall have all of America's industry and finance controlled by less than a dozen major corporations that are owned and run by less than 100 men. Putting it plainly, we are on and are still steering a steady course toward economic and political oligarchy. And he goes on to say, in a private letter that he wrote to Colonel Edward Mandel House on November 21st of 1933, he said, the actual truth of the matter is, as both you and I know, a specific financial element in the larger centers have owned our United States government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson. And he says, and I pointed out part of the speech that he gave to the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia on June 27th of 1936, when Roosevelt said, in the first part of this you'll recognize because I quoted it to you earlier, but I'll read you further from this. He said, it was entirely natural to expect that the privileged princes of the new corporate economic dynasties, thirsting for power and profit as they are, would reach out to seek control over the government itself. They have created a new despotism and have wrapped it in the robes of legal sanctions. I pointed that one out to you earlier, but he goes on to say, in their service, these new mercenaries have sought to regiment our people, our labor, and our property. And as a result, the average person once more confronts the same adversary that confronted the Minutemen before and during our American Revolution. The hours that our men and women now work, the wages that they receive, the conditions under which they must labor, have all passed out of the control of the people and are now being imposed upon us by this new financial industrial dictatorship. The private savings of the average family, the small amount of capital that can be generated by the small business person, the investments set aside by men and women for their old age, all other people's money has now been transformed into the tools by means of which the membership of this new economic royal class have dug themselves in. Those who till the soil are no longer the ones who reap the rewards which are their birthright. The small measure of their gains are now decreed by men in distant cities. Throughout our nation, the opportunity for small businessmen is being limited by growing corporate capitalist monopolies. Individual initiative is being crushed in the cogs of this great corporate machine. The field, once open and free for small business people, has grown more and more restricted. Private enterprise has now become privileged enterprise, no longer free enterprise. For most of us now, the political equality that we once believed that we had finally won has become meaningless in the face of this new economic oligarchy. A very small group of extremely wealthy and powerful men have now concentrated into their hands almost the complete control over other people's property, I'd read this part, other people's money, other people's labor, and other people's lives. For too many of us, our lives no longer are truly free. Our liberty is no longer real, for we are no longer able to truly pursue our own happiness. In the face of such economic tyranny as this, our people can appeal only to the organized power of our government placed in good hands that we have created to protect democracy. And he points out, I'll just close with this, is the history of the past century, that is between 1880 and 1980, has in large measure been the history of a comparatively small number of financial titans whose methods of accumulating wealth and power were scrutinized with far too little care, and who have become honored only in proportion to the degree that their efforts have produced the results of high financial reward, irrespective of the means that they employed to achieve it. And they go on and on with quotations like this. Franklin Roosevelt, in the wake of the economic depression of 1929, and the consequences that befell the country that were extremely analogous to those events that even though it was 8 years ago and you were younger, this peculiar thing that happened in 2008, right after it became clear that Barack Obama was going to be the new president, that all of these major banking interests and financial interests rushed into the United States Congress and rushed into W. Bush, who was still in office, and said, we need to have $800 billion transferred to us right now, or else the entire banking and financial system is going to collapse. And so W. Bush began at that time to extend those kind of grants to the major banking interests to prop them up and to enable them to continue their monopoly control over the finances and the production of most of the materials in the country. Now, this week, in the 5th and 6th classes of the course, out of the 20, we're going to be turning our attention to focus on the period between the end of the American Civil War in 1868 all the way up to the end of World War I in 1918. In this 50-year period, we're going to talk about what it is that happened in the United States that generated this type of economic oligarchy. The very people that are being talked about by Woodrow Wilson as of 1914, 1916, in 1913, even when he was talking in some of these quotations. And we're going to talk about the rise of the Chautauqua Movement, a movement that was initiated by the National Board of Homeland Ministries of the United Methodist Church to try to counter the cultural and economic effects of this new royalist oligarchy in the country. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to turn our attention to what it is how this happened. What happened is that now, remember, what we were all taught back in high school, and you were still taught in high school, just like I was taught back in high school, that the American Civil War was fought to free the slaves. That the North, being the kind of wonderful people that they all were basically had to respond to the effort on the part of the Southern states to secede, because the Southern states thought that the Northern states in the federal government were going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation freeing all the slaves. And so the South rose up and attempted to secede from the United States and attacked Fort Sumter, and the Northern military forces were forced to respond, and that's how the American Civil War was fought. And the Southern states fought to try to preserve slavery, and the North fought to free the slaves. And when the North won, the slaves were all freed, and that was it. Well, but the fact is that you may have started to get some kind of a hint now up at the college level in history courses that there was another dynamic going on at that time, and that the northern states were becoming more and more industrialized and urbanized, and that there was an entirely different type of economic culture in the northern states than in the southern states, which were more rural and agrarian, and that the power of the industrialists in the north began to assert themselves in the ownership of railroads, in iron and steel mills, and in other production facilities. It was just beginning, and that they asserted their power in the federal legislature to begin to do certain things to assert their dominion over the government. And so what happened is at the end of the American Civil War in 1868, you had the passage of not just the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery in the United States, but the 14th Amendment, which actually did a lot more than simply establish the equal rights of black people, because that was done in the 13th Amendment, and that the United States Congress was given power in the second article of the 13th Amendment to actually pass laws to insist upon the freedom and the equality of people in the black race. But the 14th Amendment did something quite more startling, and that is that it established the authority of the federal government over the states to demand that the state statutes all be subject to standards that were being imposed by the federal government. And it codified a new balance of power that was now in the hands of the federal government as distinct from the state government. And it initiated a whole round of litigation that is still going on under the auspices of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, in which the federal courts impose upon states certain standards that they're required to abide by with regard to the due process of law in the protection of certain fundamental rights, such as free speech and freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, etc. And so what happened is that as the federal government asserted this superior power, the industrialists that in fact had risen to power, or began to rise to power before the Civil War, they established a new, and this is critical, a new form of business enterprise. They created this thing called the stockholder-owned corporation. And what they did, and I just touched upon this in the opening lecture, and that is they established a business vehicle pursuant to which the owners of the business, the de facto owners of all of the capital resources of the corporation, were completely immunized against any legal liability for anything that the corporation did. And yet, they were entitled at the same time to divide up among themselves all of the profits that were made by the corporation. And moreover, they established this doctrine called ultra vires. And what it means is that the board of directors of the corporation were charged with the legal responsibility for placing absolute exclusive value upon the maximization of the profits of the company so that they could generate the maximum amount of profit to be distributed to the owners of the shares of the corporation. And they too were immunized against any personal liability for any conduct on the part of the corporation itself. And so you had the owners of the corporation that owned the stock, that were entitled to divvy up the profits, completely immunized. You had the board of directors that was in charge of directing the day-to-day operations of the corporation, were immunized. And it turns out that the management officials, the CEO and the management officials, were also immunized against any personal liability. The only entity that remained legally liable for any conduct undertaken on behalf of the corporation was in fact the corporation itself. And that is the specific assets that were officially registered as belonging to that corporation. And what they did is they actually went to the lengths of establishing subsidiaries of their corporation. And they set up a subsidiary, and they delegated a certain limited amount of the resources of the mother corporation into the subsidiary, and then they incorporated the subsidiary. And so that the only assets that were potentially at risk were those that they had isolated out and put in the hands of the subsidiary. And so that therefore the mother lode of assets and resources that were owned by the corporation and all of the stockholders were not even at risk themselves. Just that small portion that they had delegated and put into the hands of the subsidiary. And so what happened is, as I say, they established this concept of ultra vires for the board of directors, and that doctrine said that it would be a cause for termination as a member of the board of directors of a corporation if that director were to take into account any aspect of the public interest in making their decisions over the policies of the corporation as distinct from the interests of the stockholders in maximizing their profit. And so, in short, you could be fired for, in fact, trying to take into account the interests of the community. And so therefore, if, for example, you had a mining corporation that could mine the gold out of the hills using arsenic, and then you would pump all of the extra arsenic and toxins into the local river, and it would go down the river and poison everybody downstream, that you needed to make that type of decision as a member of the board of directors, because you would not want to have to incur the additional expense of sequestering those toxins and having to spend the money disposing of them in some safe way. And so that it would actually constitute a cause of action to have you relieved of your position for cause if you made the decision that took into account the interests of the public. So this set of business practices began in earnest after the American Civil War in 1868, pursuant to which the corporations pursued raw self-interest, unabrogated self-interest in the maximization of personal profit for the owners of the stock in the corporations, and avoided any type of legal liability. So needless to say, the conduct of those corporations became more and more harsh, because the organizing principle of the entire organization was just to maximize profits. And so they would crush any people who tried to ask for raises. They would just fire them out of line, and that they would crush anybody who tried to compete with them. They would bribe government officials to try to get contracts for the company, and they would go through a whole. They would pay the employees as little as they could possibly pay them, and still be able to get people to work for them. They would not take the slightest care for protecting the health and safety of the workers. They would be working in totally contaminated areas, giving them diseases around machinery that would cut off their fingers and hands, and heavy objects would fall on them and they would be maimed, and then they would fire them. And they felt no obligation of any kind. Why should they? Pay for the hospitalization of the person or pay for their living after they've been injured, because they were no longer of any worth to the company. And so that this particular dynamic continued to develop from 1868 all the way to 1878, that entire decade following the American Civil War. And what happened is that the National Board of Homeland Ministries of the United Methodist Church became so upset at the conditions that were obtaining in the mines. They had little children who were 6 and 7 years old that they brought into the mines, and they would work 12 to 14-hour days in the mine. Because they were so small, they could crawl into little places and place the detonators and dynamite for blowing up the coal. And the kids would get trapped and blown up and killed, or they'd lose an arm or a leg or something, and then they would just fire the kids. You've heard all the information about the terrible sweatshops that they had in the cities for young women, that they were hired in textile mills, and they would be working in these mills and in the laundry houses and stuff. Yes?
Sorry, I didn't mean to derail what you're saying. I was just confused by what you're talking about with the subsidiary corporations, how they're the only ones with responsible assets. How does that work?
What they do is they set up a shield, they set up a veil basically between the main corporation, and they set up a separate corporation, and they delegate out a series of funds for them, and then they have their own separate board of directors.
Yeah.
And then they continue to operate. And what they argue is if anybody sues them for any activity they engaged in, the only assets, the corporation will argue, the only assets that are at stake, if in fact, say for example, a person sues them for $1 million for injuries, and they say, oh well, we only have $500,000 in the bank for the assets of that company, and so therefore we can't pay you. So even if they get a judgment against them, they say that they're in effect judgment proof for mainly it's class actions that they have to really worry about, the bigger amounts. But that's the same principle, is that what the plaintiff would have to argue in that case is that, wait a second, this is a load of crap. Everybody knows that you're basically just an arm of this other major corporation, but they would have to go through an entire additional burden of proof to what they call pierce the corporate veil. And so that they would draw this veil around the other corporation and say that they've actually spun it off as a separate corporation. And it's not the same company at all, and you can't get at the assets of the larger corporation to pay the judgment. Yes?
And then so the corporation would delegate the riskier activities that they undertake to these subsidiaries?
Oh yes, and do it consciously. Because they say, no, look, this is a dangerous one that we're engaged in here. It's potentially, for example, a petroleum corporation would set up a private nuclear power company. And they would say, a nuclear power company could really cause a huge, gigantic tragedy. It would cost us billions of dollars. So they set up the company, and the petroleum company that actually set it up pretends that they're a completely separate company. But in fact, they have the same people on the board of directors, same people own the stock in that company, and the assets came from the other company, but then they pay them back after they've made enough money, and so that they try to set it up that way. That's how they do it.
Is
Yes?
it the same as the Panama Papers shell corporations that they were talking about?
Well, the shell corporations are actually usually just investment places. They just store their money there. They have accounts that they set them up. The shell companies are companies that are nothing more than what they call holding companies. So for example, there'll be 3 different corporations that are functioning in the United States, and that they place their profits all go out to this other company, which is a holding company, and they actually call them that. It's a holding company. What it does is holds the profits, and it's set up solely for the purposes of avoiding paying taxes. And so that whenever you see a holding company, this is one of the tactics that was devised by the corporations, and they have a whole bunch of different tactics. For example, they would have a corporation that, for example, was an agricultural corporation that grew wheat, and then what they would do is they would have another company that in fact would transport the wheat from the fields to the granary. And then they would have another corporation that owned the granary. But it turns out that 3/4 of the people that were on the boards of directors of all 3 of these were all the same. They're all the same people. And it turns out that the people who owned the stock in each of the 3 companies were all the same. And yet they would just maintain that they were separate companies, or separate corporations, but even though the people who owned them and the people who ran them from their board of directors were all the same, they would maintain they were separate companies. And that way what they would do is they would establish a horizontal monopoly and a vertical monopoly. They would monopolize the production of the wheat, the transportation of the wheat, the milling of the wheat, the selling of the wheat, that they would establish what is called a vertical monopoly over the entire industry. And yet they would maintain that it was all different companies. In this issue, or this particular tactic of the establishment of interlocking directorates, became extremely important, because what happened is that some of the richest and the most powerful men that owned, for example, the steel mill, say a Carnegie Steel or U.S. Steel, what they would do is they would sit on the board of directors of E.H. Harriman's railroad company that did the transportation of the steel, okay? And then they would also sit on the board of directors of a financing company that would give you the loans to run the company. And what happened is you'd stand back and you'd look at the top 25 corporations that were engaged in the key business activity of the country, such as, you know, steel production, food production, weapons production, communications, petroleum, and you look at these 25 companies, and it turns out that there's 50 men who are on the board of directors of virtually all of these companies. You just look at them as a diagram, and you find that these 50 men end up being on the board of directors of all of these top 25 corporations, and it turns out that they also are stockholders in all of these corporations. And then you suddenly begin to realize that there's 50 men who are running the entire economy, and that they're responsible for hiring all of these people, and they're responsible for the policies of those businesses. And then what you discover is that these people, these men, are paying for the campaigns of the people who run for the United States Congress, both the House and the Senate. And they're paying for the campaigns of the people in the state legislatures who are passing the laws that govern their business conduct in certain states. And basically, these guys, if you confront them with that, they'll just say to you, well, yeah. I mean, you know, why wouldn't you do that? And the argument would be is, well, because it's contrary to the interest of the public, because if you have a monopoly control over the production and the transportation and the milling and the selling of food, well, then basically you have a monopoly over the production of the food, of the grains, and you can charge any price you want. That has nothing to do with the free market at all. And they would say, well, yeah. Why wouldn't you do that? And then the answer would have to be is, well, because people are starving. And then they'd say, well, then they ought to get a job. You know, and then you say, well, the only jobs they can get are the jobs with you guys because you own everything and you won't pay them enough to live. And then they would say, so much the better. And then they would invoke the doctrine of social Darwinism, which was a major prominent theme throughout this entire period. It was in 1848 that Charles Darwin wrote the theory of evolution. And what?
The book's called The Origin of the
Yes, The Origin of the Species, that's right. And basically, this basic concept was extended out into the entire culture. And what they were saying is that if, in fact, a certain person or group of people it proves to be unable to survive in direct competition with others who are smarter, faster, stronger, anything else you want to call it, then they should in fact just basically perish, because they'll just fall out of the gene pool. And then the species will be better for all of that. And they got into all kinds of things like special breeding, you know, that they would all intermarry in each other's families. Very, very common, just like royalty in Europe, is that they would all marry each other's cousins, you know, in the families. And that's what was happening in the United States, is that the president of one corporation, his eldest son would marry the eldest daughter of the president of another corporation, and then they would bring their ownership of the stock that they inherited together into one family, and then they would continue to sit on the boards of directors. Their children would sit on the board of directors because they'd inherit the stock. And so what they had done is they had developed not only a business vehicle by means of which they could establish immunity for themselves against any legal liability. They had actually created a business vehicle that could function completely in disregard of any moral values whatsoever, because moral values were irrelevant to the production of profit. Now, if in fact they were engaged in a certain kind of conduct that was causing people to refuse to buy their products, for example, they might reconsider. But if in fact people were organizing to refuse to buy their products, what they would do is they would go out and beat up and kill the people who were organizing those kind of movements. And they did that stuff all the time. They hired gun thugs, and that's where the term comes from, that Smedley, Major General Smedley Butler was saying. A gun thug was a person that was hired actually to engage in brutal activities toward people who were organizing in opposition to the interests of the corporation. Yes?
Are there analogies to this today? Because now it seems like you can pretty freely boycott a company's products at least. But yeah, I was just wondering if there are analogies like this today, because obviously they call today the second guild age for a reason.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, for example, a classic example is Shell Oil in Nigeria. You know, the Shell Oil is trying to develop the oil in Nigeria, and the local people were organizing there to try to stop them from drilling oil in the middle of their jungles and stuff. And the company hired people from Blackwater to go out and kill them. And that's what they did. They go out and kill them, and they just dump them in the swamps, you know. And they're doing the same thing down in Latin America. The big corporations down there, the big meat packing corporations that are cutting down rainforests, you know, 80,000 acres a day. 80,000 acres a day down there, cutting down rainforests and then burning them, and not only taking those trees out of the ecology that transform carbon dioxide into oxygen, the lungs of the planet, but also burning them and putting all that carbon up into the atmosphere. And the people who are organizing to try to stop them from doing that, the indigenous people down there, are being killed. They just send gun thugs into their house and gun them down. In any type of effort to sue them to stop this thing, they control the courts down there. And they still do this today. So yes, there's plenty of analogies today. There were famous companies, for example, the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons were a particular, quote, private detective bureau that were basically gun thugs. And the Pinkertons were hired by the railroad companies, by E.H. Harriman and others. They were hired as strike breakers because what happened is that in 1874, it actually started, that the National Board of Homeland Ministries were so offended at the kind of policies that were being pursued by these robber barons, this new rising class of robber barons, that I mentioned it in passing, but I just want to slow it down a little bit and tell you what happened here, is that the Board of Homeland Ministries established a program up at their summer camp that was up in northern New York, right up by Buffalo, New York. They had a big summer camp on Lake Chautauqua. And what they did is they invited any person who was going to be an instructor in their Methodist Sunday schools to come with their family for the summer up to Lake Chautauqua in New York, and they could live there at Lake Chautauqua for free for the entire 3 months of the summer, and they would be taking courses there daily discussing how it is that the values that were being reflected by the robber barons in their business practices were contrary to the ethical principles of Judeo-Christian beliefs. And so they were actually instructing their Bible school teachers about the contrary nature of the business activities of the robber barons to Judeo-Christian principles. And that went on from 1874 to 1878 for 4 summers. And then they decided, the Board of Homeland Ministries decided this was going too slowly. And so what they did is they issued a public invitation to all social studies teachers everywhere in the country to come to Chautauqua in the summer of 1878 and bring their families with them, and they could be in residence at Lake Chautauqua, and they could take these courses for free for the entire summer. And what happened is thousands of social studies teachers from the high schools and junior high schools around the country flooded to the Chautauqua in northern New York. And there were so many of them there, I touched upon this in the first lecture, there were so many of them there that they couldn't feed them all, and they couldn't house them all. And so all of the people that lived in the community around Lake Chautauqua invited them to come and stay at their houses, and that they would feed them and they would shelter them, and they were supportive of these classes that were going on there. And so that this event was just like Woodstock. Because it started raining up there in the summertime, and they didn't have any, so that what they did is they put them up in all these houses in this extraordinary kind of communitarian spirit started to develop all around that area of the country where hundreds and hundreds of families were putting people up for free and participating in discussing the classes that were going on there. And then what happened is the following summer, because there were so many people that summer of 1878, in the summer of 1879, they set up 4 regional Chautauquas. And the same thing happened again. They were overrun with social studies teachers from around the country that wanted to take these courses. And so then they set up smaller Chautauquas, and it turns out that eventually some 40 million Americans attended these Chautauquas, because they opened up the Chautauquas for regular civilian people to come to listen to these classes, to read the books that were being assigned, to engage in the discussions. And they had music, and they had poetry, and they had people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Clarence Darrow, Eugene Debs. A whole group of people began to go to these Chautauquas and to be speakers at the Chautauquas. So they'd have speakers, they would have music and poetry, they would have books assigned to read, they'd have reading clubs, etc. What they were doing is they were organizing and mobilizing the American people from a moral, ethical perspective to rise up against the robber barons. And what they did is the Chautauqua Movement, and it became known as a movement throughout the country, generated labor unions for the very first time. This is where the whole idea of organizing as workers came from, of organizing together in a collective and agreeing to join together to go on strike against a given corporation that was refusing to provide for safe working conditions, refusing to provide adequate salaries, that were firing people or beating them up if they tried to challenge any of the health standards in the plant. So labor unions were generated out of the Chautauqua movement. Also, the women's suffrage movement was born in the Chautauquas. And the people coming together to discuss this, because a lot of the social studies teachers in the high schools at the time were women. And then when they came to the Chautauquas, they would all be there and they would say, hey, look, we're the majority here. Why is it we don't get to vote? What's the story here? And so what they did is they began to organize. And you've seen some of the even movies that are out that show how radical that organizing became. That they would not only strike against a given textile mill or a laundry or sewing companies. They would not only strike, but they would chain the doors to not let the management get in. They would basically actually set on fire some of the wagons and stuff that were used. It became very aggressive, the women's movement, until finally in 1919, it took some time. In 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed by Congress that actually said, okay, you can vote. Okay, so that, and they also had Dewey, John Dewey was one of the major speakers at these Chautauquas, and they generated the public school system, a free public school system. And they also generated the anti-child labor laws to stop the employment of 6- and 7-year-old children in the mines, etc. they also started imposing safety standards in corporations. And so what they did is they turned their attention to combating the lobbying that was going on the part of the corporations in the state legislatures and in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. They would mobilize these people through the churches to write to their congressman, to campaign against the congressman if they didn't support the legislation, etc. And they also generated the first environmental movement in the country, calling for the preservation of forests and in grasslands and other areas around the country, to preserve them, to keep them from being developed by the corporations. And so the Chautauqua Movement became a very specific, self-conscious movement to try to neutralize and offset the policies and principles of the robber barons during that entire time. And so it's an important movement for you to find out about, because the bottom line is it began to establish the principles of socialism in the United States, to socialize the policies of business, to socialize the policies of the government, to try to insist that the government assert itself to move some of the profits from the major corporations and limit the profits. And so they began to move toward establishing a federal income tax system to take funds from the wealthy people and transfer them to the other people. So they began to use the tools of government. The Chautauqua Movement began to seize and take control over the government itself in challenging the robber barons. Yes, I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask, when people teach about the progressive era, they're really big on expose journalism, and I was wondering if there was like any attempts to suppress like media coverage of these kind of events.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. There was the fact is that there were a number of major journalists that were writing at that time that were covering the various movements, the labor movement. They were writing. There was a group called the Wobblies that were a very aggressive labor union. United Mine Workers were formed that went on strike. They had a huge strike against the mines up in Idaho, and the United States military forces were called in to combat the miners. And there were gunfights between the miners and the American military forces. Now there's a movie, in fact, that you should see, and you want to see the whole movie, not the 90-minute version of the movie, which was terrible. But there's a movie that's called Heaven's Gate, and Michael Camino did it. He's the guy that did The Deer Hunter. Has anybody here seen The Deer Hunter? See, I know. I've got to keep this in mind. That the great thing about getting to teach a course like this is there's a whole bunch of stuff that you guys haven't gotten a chance to hear about yet. And so I get an opportunity to kind of help steer you towards some of these things. But you should take a look at The Deer Hunter, which is Michael Camino directed it. Robert De Niro was in it. Christopher Walken. And a bunch of other folks. Meryl Streep was in it. It was one of Meryl Streep's very first movies. But there's a second movie that he made called Heaven's Gate, and it is a portrayal of a young man played by Chris Christopherson, who graduates from Harvard College in about 1850, and he eventually becomes the United States Marshal. And he, in fact, is a United States Marshal out in the Nebraska Territory later in the 1880s, in 1870s, 1880s, this period that we're talking about. And what happened is the Cattlemen's Association the major wealthy, powerful ranchers that were working with the railroad companies to ship livestock back east to provide meat into the big cities, the urban cities of the north. They organized themselves into the American Cattlemen's Association, and they hired gun thugs to attack the people who were immigrants that came in, and under the Dawes Act of 1897, they actually were given land, homesteading land, and the Cattlemen's Association moved in and had them murdered to take their land away because they wanted to have it for cattle grazing, etc. And that you see in this movie, in the Heaven's Gate, this extraordinary venal self-interest on the part of the Cattlemen's Association that resorts to hiring gun thugs to murder and kill people, and you see a rising kind of consciousness on the part of the people that is antithetical to the corporate mindset, and that you start to get some kind of a sense in that movie about this class warfare that people talk about, because that's what the major capitalists confronted the organized labor movement that came up out of the Chautauqua Movement, basically attacking them as terrorists, saying that these people who were organizing strikes against the company and setting up picket lines were terrorists because they were implicitly threatening people. You know, when the workers had been spent all this time getting beaten up by gun thugs, what they did is they organized themselves, and if the gun thugs came and tried to attack them, they would attack them back. And of course, the capitalists were always making the argument that this trouble all started when they hit us back. That was their basic position, is, oh, you know, that we've been attacking them for years, but now they're fighting back, so now they're criminals. And there's a number of other movies. There's the group called the Molly Maguires. The Molly Maguires were another group of mine workers that they were radical mine workers that were organizing. In the Wobblies that you will hear about. But all of these movements came out of the Chautauqua Movement around the United States. And what I want to do is I want to point us toward what you're going to be doing. You're going to be doing on Thursday. When, as I mentioned to you, I was unable to change these things, but I've got these two television interviews I've got to do live in Denver, Colorado on Thursday. So what I'm going to do is there's a major presentation that I made up at the university in Oregon about this complex subject that I'm just going to broach today with you. But the bottom line is that what you saw developing with the robber barons in this 50-year period between 1868 and 1918, you saw the development of an entire mindset, which actually was a worldview that entailed social Darwinism, the entire theory of evolution, that they were an elite Caucasian subspecies, basically, that in fact was entitled to rule, and that the people at the other end of the spectrum, the black people and the people of color around the world, that they actually viewed as a subspecies that was not entitled to live. That there was actually there was a quote that we had that it was about the people in Hawaii, that there was in 1893. In 1893, the Secretary of State under Harriman was a man by the name of John W. Foster, and he actually supervised the United States military overthrow of the Hawaiian Islands, in Guam, in the Marshall Islands, and the taking of a bunch, and started setting up the preparation for the United States military to take over the island of Cuba. You heard General Smedley Butler kind of relate a number of the invasions, paramilitary or foreign military expeditionary forces that he led down through that period from 1903 to 1912, that he talked about these one after another in Latin America, where he went in with U.S. military forces. Well, they were being prepared in 1893 to take over the Hawaiian Islands and the islands in the Pacific, and then in 1898 to take over Cuba. And John W. Foster, when challenged for his military overthrow of the Hawaiian Islands, he actually asserted that these people were simply sitting on all of these resources and not knowing enough to develop them. And that because they didn't know enough to develop the resources where they lived, they weren't entitled to be in control of those resources. That we were entitled to have control of the resources because we knew enough as to what to do with them. And that was that, and he said it right straight out, unabashedly. And that was the entire theory that undergirded the robber baron mentality. But what I want to do is I want to broach today in preliminary form the explication of how deep these worldviews go. Because what you see developing with the Chautauqua Movement, you see developing a completely alternative worldview to the worldview that was adhered to by members of the robber barons. And what I want to do today is I want to, it'll be a little bit repetitive of some of the stuff you'll see in much greater detail on Thursday. But what I want to do is I want to point out to you, first I want to lay out for you just in a very preliminary form what the spectrum of worldviews is, so that you can locate on that spectrum of worldviews these two particular worldviews that we're talking about here. The robber baron worldview and the Chautauqua Movement worldview. We'll refer to them that way to start with. But this is something that it was peculiar. I mean, I had graduated from Harvard College, studied under Henry Kissinger and David Reisman and Ken Galbraith for economics. I did all of that stuff and got all the way through that and graduated with honors. Went to Harvard Law School and ran the Civil Rights Law Review and everything. And at no time did they ever tell us about what I'm getting ready to tell you about. That they just assumed that we all realized at Harvard College and Harvard Law School that we were supposed to be running the world, and that it was perfectly okay for you to go out and decide what the policies of the United States government are going to be. But they never explained why it is that we were particularly entitled to do this. But what happened is after I got out and I was practicing law for a number of years and went to the #1 Wall Street law firm, litigation law firm for 2 years, and went to F. Lee Bailey's office for another year. I ended up going back to Harvard to do my PhD in comparative ethics, and I ended up studying under Dr. Ralph Potter. And Dr. Ralph Potter was the protege of Talcott Parsons. Talcott Parsons was the 34-year chairman of the Department of Sociology at Harvard University. And he is the one that developed the political bar graph or spectrum, where you hear people being referred to as left-wingers and right-wingers. You just are born into everybody talking about all the time. But that came from the development of the sociological bar graph by Talcott Parsons. That what he did is he and his students over this 34-year period would interview tens of thousands of people asking them a series of some 100 questions about what they would prefer doing with regard to certain public policy questions. You know, do you favor the use of first strike nuclear weapons? Do you favor capital punishment? Do you support abortion? Do you think that every person should have the same vote? You know, 100 different divergent public policies. They would ask people for their position on those things. And they went through what they call an inductive process of gathering together all of those answers. And then they wanted to see whether or not the answers to all of those questions induced certain patterns that could be discerned. And what they concluded, what Talcott Parsons concluded at the end of many years of such research, inductive research, he believed that the data that was gathered induced certain basic conclusions on his part. And what he concluded was that whenever a human community is confronted by a particular public policy problem, that we divide ourselves into basically 5 different groups. And that the group that he referred to is the first group that they analyzed was the group that they referred to as right systematists. And at the other far end of the spectrum of the 5 groups of people, he said there was this other group that were left systematists. Now, that doesn't tell you much, except that he said that they were categorically distinct in their worldviews. And he said that inside on this spectrum of worldviews, there was another group that he referred to as right marginalists, just because they were marginal to the right systematists. And then he said on the other end, there were the, yes, you guessed it, left marginalists. And then in the middle, he referred to them as the middle marginalists. And he said that people fell into these particular groupings, and you could, by looking at their answers to these questions, you could tell that if in fact a person, for example, supported criminal sanctions against a woman who had an abortion, such as Donald Trump mentioned the other day, that he thought women ought to be punished some way if women had an abortion, is that a person who supported criminally punishing women who had an abortion also systematically supported the death penalty and supported the first strike use of nuclear weapons and supported aggressive wars to protect our interests and in fact opposed labor unions. In fact, opposed women's rights to vote. Thought that in fact there should be discriminatory laws protecting women because of your vulnerable status, etc. And women should not be allowed to be in the military. And there was a whole systemic set of beliefs that these people had. And at the other extreme, he discovered that people who in fact believed that women had a right to choose also believed that women ought to have a right to vote, and also believed that it was immoral and illegal to engage in the first use of nuclear weapons, and also supported labor union, the right to organize in labor, and that they too had a completely systematic set of beliefs that arose up out of this random questioning of tens of thousands of people. And then they discovered that there was another group of people that were the right marginalists that, while they didn't always believe systematically in the answers that the right systematists believed in, they believed in these things most of the time. That most of the time they were consistent with these people here. But every once in a while they would fall away from some of those beliefs and would articulate a different belief. But it was usually just a somewhat limited percentage of these other positions over here. And the same thing was true in the opposite end of the spectrum with left marginalists. And then they discovered that there was this group in the middle marginalists, who were doing this. You know, that they were, in a certain sense, all over the lot. But they were consistently so. And so he developed this whole process so that they ended up calling these people right-wingers and these people left-wingers under Talcott Parsons' sociological bar graph. Well, what Dr. Ralph Potter did, Dr. Ralph Potter, who was a PhD student who studied under Talcott Parsons, he, of course, said to himself, which was kind of a logical question, you say, what causes people to do this? Why is it that two people raised often in the same family will be a right systematist and someone else in the family is a left systematist? They're born in the same family, they're born in the same town, you know, that they eat the same food. You know, why is it that they do this? And so Ralph Potter set himself to trying to figure out why it is that our human family, when confronted by a given public policy decision or problem, divide ourselves into these 5 specific camps. And what Ralph Potter discovered was that what causes people to do this is the fact that virtually every woman and every man in the world that turns their attention to thinking hard enough about a certain number of fundamental questions having to do with reality itself, have 4 fundamental questions about the nature of ultimate reality. And depending upon how one answers those fundamental questions, it will determine what worldview you adhere to. And what Dr. Potter came to conclude was that there were these 4 fundamental questions about the nature of ultimate reality. And the first of these questions is, how come there's anything here? I mean, how did our universe actually come into being? This is what is known as the fundamental cosmological question. The cosmological question. It's the cosmic question. You know, how did the universe come into being? And the second most fundamental question is, once you determine how the universe came into being, is the universe evolving in some kind of teleological direction? Teleology is just a big fancy word for, is it unfolding in some particular predictable pattern? Is the universe unfolding towards some specific identifiable end point? Or is it totally chaotic? Is there no pattern to anything that's going on? Is it completely random what's happening here? Or is it developing teleologically? The third fundamental question is the question of how did consciousness actually arise? This experience that we're all having, riding around up here behind our eyeballs, kind of walking around, looking out at everything else, and realizing that we are kind of like a separate entity and there's all this stuff going on out around us, and that we are conscious of ourself being here. And how did this happen? If in fact what you've got is a bunch of chemicals going on in the universe and coming together and forming, major clumps of rocks and stars and planets and stuff, how did consciousness actually come into being? And this is another big, just simply big fancy word for it, but it's the ontological question. The ontological question is, what is the nature of consciousness, the nature of being in a separate entity? This entification question. We are a separate entity. There is a bottle, there is a chair, there is a tree, there is a lake. Are these real things? Are these real entities? Do they have their own specific, wholly integrated integrity that they constitute a thing that is actually a thing like we are, but that we're conscious? Where did consciousness come from in the midst of all of these inanimate things? And then the fourth of these fundamental questions that they referred to as the epistemological question. The epistemological question is basically just another great big fancy word for the question as to what are the means that we have at our disposal as human beings by means of which we can possibly answer cosmic questions like this. Are we limited to the 5 senses that the scientific community has, by its consensus, concluded that we have, of hearing and seeing and tasting and touching and smelling? Are we limited to taking in data through these 5 senses and processing them through our intellect and coming to conclusions? And is this the only means that we have at our disposal of taking in the data through our 5 senses and processing it through our intellect, the only way that we can answer any of these other 3 cosmic questions? And these taken together are what they refer to as the fundamental pillar questions. These are the pillar questions upon which a worldview is based. Because, as it turns out, if a person answers each of the 3 additional questions in a manner that is completely internally and self-referentially consistent with the answer they provide to each of the other 4 questions, it will actually generate, when you come to these factual conclusions, it will actually generate a specific mode of ethical reasoning. Now, and when you think about it, that's perfectly logical. If you come to a set of conclusions regarding these 4 fundamental questions about the nature of ultimate reality, that when you're faced with a particular question to resolve, you'll want to resolve that question in a way that is consistent with what you understand to be true. That's what you'll want to do. You want to be able to make a choice that is consistent with what you understand to be true. And these are the fundamental questions about the ultimate nature of truth in the universe. And what you discover is that when in fact you apply this particular mode of ethical reasoning to any of the normal challenges or questions that you are confronted with in the world, and you provide a consistent answer pursuant to a consistent application of this specific mode of ethical reasoning to the resolution of each of those questions, it will generate an entire consistent philosophy. This is where the philosophies come from. This is why there are completely different philosophies that different people hold. Because as it turns out, they systematically and consistently apply a specific mode of ethical reasoning to these fundamental questions. And so therefore, everybody thinks they're really smart. That these are the big philosophers. These are the people that can write for hours on any given question, and they always have a clear answer to the question as to whether you can decipher it in their language or not. But the bottom line is, it generates a philosophy. And this philosophy, when applied to the particular question of how a particular polity or human community ought to go about resolving its public questions, it will generate a political philosophy. And so what you discover when you use what they call Potter's box, and you apply the answers to these fundamental pillar questions, and if you can develop an answer that is completely internally and self-referentially consistent to every one of these four questions, and generate a specific mode of ethical reasoning that flows directly, deductively from this, and apply it to the general questions of life, you have a philosophy and a political philosophy. And so what Ralph Potter did is he said, look, that what we're really dealing with here, then, with all of these different positions of the right systematists and left systematists and left middle marginalists and right middle marginalists and middle marginalists, what we're really dealing with here is a system of beliefs that generate on the far right, the right systematists politically, from the view of a political philosophy, generate authoritarians. And the right marginalists are, in fact, reactionaries. And on the over here, that you have moderates. And over here, you have progressives, who are your left marginalists, and the moderates are, not surprisingly, your middle marginalists, and your left systematists, you have what they call utopianists. Now, what I was writing my PhD thesis on at Harvard was the fact that I believed, and wrote an analysis to try to assert it, part of which you see in some of the readings that I've given to you from the paradigm politics, the two major readings I've had you do out of that, is that the fact is that there are, I believe, 7 of the major groups, not 5. And that what he was leaving out the major conservatives and liberals. So when you get all 7 of these major worldviews laid out systematically like this, you move from the right wing, from authoritarians to reactionaries to conservatives to moderates to liberals to progressives to utopianists. And so what you discover, you find people in all the talk shows kind of throwing these things around, and they love to lump everybody in as conservatives over in the Republican Party. But what they've come to the shocking realization is that there are some people in the Republican Party that are complete reactionaries. And that's what you're running into now. These extreme right-wing elements in the Republican Party are basically setting forth reactionary positions. You'll see in the deeper discussion that I have of these things, it's in the video that you'll see on Thursday, points out why it is, what are the cosmological, teleological, ontological, and epistemological beliefs that actually characterize these people. Why is it that a reactionary believes the way they do? It's because they answer these 4 pillar questions in a particular way that is completely internally and self-referentially consistent. And so therefore they can predictably make these conclusions. And I'll point out just quickly for you, checking what we're looking at here for our time. Let me just, okay, just what you see is that an authoritarian cosmologically, and you'll see how profound this gets to be for you and why it's so important in this course for you to keep this in mind when you're thinking and writing, that cosmologically the authoritarians believe that the entire physical universe began with a big bang at one particular point and is expanding out and away from the locus of the Big Bang in all directions, and in fact every single entity in the entire universe is made up of a finite number of ultimately irreducible integers of matter, and that these ultimately irreducible integers of matter are all disintegrating. They're all coming apart. That every single element on the entire periodic table is disintegrating into its lower constituent elements. And at the same time as it is expanding, the universe expanding out and away from the locus of the Big Bang, so that ultimately you will be faced in time with a condition in which every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical cosmos is separate and apart from every other one. And that the impetus that has been imposed upon them by the Big Bang will cause them to continue to expand out and away from each other forever. Because there's nothing slowing them down. And so that they will just expand out and away from each other into a condition of no thing. Nothing. Except a finite number of ultimately irreducible integers of matter expanding out and away from each other into the infinity of the universe. And so this is an entropy model, the disintegration of the universe, the expansion and disintegration of the universe. And basically, because of this cosmological view, they believe that basically everything is going to nothing. And so therefore, there is no real referent, no moral referent in relationship to which you can discern anything that is right or wrong, or good or bad. And so therefore, all things are possible. And what they believe is that as I say, teleologically, the cosmos is just moving toward this state of disintegration, and that there's a regular, consistent, trackable pattern that is going on in the universe. And that and that they believe ontologically, consciousness is nothing more than basically an epiphenomenon of the confluence of mass and energy. That a certain confluence of mass and energy come together and it generates an epiphenomenon of consciousness. And so that the consciousness will eventually become conscious and can actually exercise authority over a limited range of matter to actually exercise power and control over it. But that's all that consciousness is it's an accidental epiphenomenon of the interaction between mass and energy. And that epistemologically, all there is your five senses and your intellect, and you put your five senses to work discerning all the information you can get about it, and this is what you'll come to see. That this is what's happening. And in fact, you can open up virtually any one of the major scientific magazines or Nature magazine or something like this, and you'll discover this week's iteration of the discussion that's going on about whether or not the universe is expanding infinitely and whether or not it's going to ultimately just disintegrate. Or is there in fact enough matter in the universe, including dark matter or antimatter, that is going to generate enough of a bonding attraction of every single ultimately reducible integer of matter for every other one in the universe that's going to ultimately cause enough of a bonding phenomenon in the universe to slow this expansion. And so that there'll come a point in time when the expansion will stop because the impetus that has been imposed upon every one of these ultimately irreducible integers of matter by the initial Big Bang has expired. And at that point, there is enough of a bonding phenomenon of every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the universe attracting every other one that it will bring the expansion to a stop. And that in fact, if at that point the impetus of the Big Bang is expired, the bonding phenomenon will continue. And it will therefore start to draw the ultimately irreducible integers of matter back in toward each other until they start coming into contact with each other and bonding again and starting to form muons and leptons and electrons and neutrons and protons and atoms and molecules and elements and in mixtures and planets and star systems. And as it turns out, that's exactly what the reactionaries believe. What distinguishes the reactionaries from the authoritarians is that they have a different cosmology and they have a different teleology. That they actually believe that the Big Bang will expire and that the bonding attraction, remember, what we learned in high school is that every integer of matter in the universe is attracted to every other integer of matter in the universe. And that the degree of attraction is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. You remember that we all had to memorize all that? That's that one. And that therefore, no matter how expanded they get, they're attracted to each other. And if there comes a point in time when the impetus imposed upon them by the Big Bang expires, that bonding phenomenon will still remain. And that therefore it will start to draw them back into each other. And so therefore what they believe is that the teleology of the universe is not in fact just an expanding out and away from the locus of the Big Bang into absolute nothingness. What they believe is that in fact the universe will expand out to a particular point where all there is are integers of that there are inchoate quantum fields that remain in an inchoate state. And in fact, they will remain in an inchoate state for a microsecond, and then they will start to manifest as they do, either as a wave of energy or a particle of mass. And at that point in time, that they constitute matter, and they will attract each other. And that they will attract each other to the point where they start collapsing back in upon themselves in this direction, and there will come a point in time when every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe as an inchoate quantum field will actually be in direct physical contact with every other one in the universe. And this is that discussion, that silly discussion that you hear talked about all the time about the entire universe existing as the size of the head of a pin. Because at that point, every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the universe is in direct physical contact with every other one. And at that exact microsecond, the polarity of the attraction totally reverses itself, and it generates another Big Bang. And out they go again, forming, leptons and muons and electrons and neutrons and protons and atoms and molecules and planets and star systems and galaxies and consciousness in the universe. And that this process goes on, the teleology of the beliefs of the reactionaries is that in fact there's not chaos in the universe, and that your epistemological access to the phenomenon of what's going on in the universe actually enables you to discern an oscillation going on in the universe between a state of absolute separateness and absolute condensation. And that in the midst of it, you have the replay of planets and star systems and galaxies in the universe itself. And that it oscillates like a heartbeat, just residing in the infinite and eternal reaches of space. And that the cosmos oscillates like a heartbeat, expanding and contracting and expanding and contracting in eternity. And that therefore, it never had any start. It never has any ending. It just is. That it just oscillates like that forever. And that we find ourselves at any given point in time in one particular moment of this oscillation and condensation, because inside the oscillation of the expansion and condensation, there is such a thing as time. Because this takes place over a particular measurable period. And so that time is generated inside the oscillation. Okay? And that, so that's, this is, yes, this is, you should tell everybody about the essay because people are asking questions. But the bottom line is, this is an introduction to the philosophical part of the course, which is why the Department of Philosophy has agreed to give credit toward the major for this particular course. Because this is an underlying profound insight into the construction of the different philosophies and an insight into the differentiation among the different worldviews and the different political positions, political philosophies. And you'll see a greater in-depth discussion of it in the video that will be shown Thursday. But now, since I'm unfortunately not going to be here on Thursday, following the viewing of the video, actually the staff wants to also show, because that'll take about an hour of that. And then there's another video that is called The Heart of the Matter. It actually is a BBC special interview that was done back when we were doing the Iran-Contra investigation. And you'll get a look at that because we're going to be talking about that Iran-Contra thing later. But with regard to the essay, there's this, this happens every quarter, there's a consistent request, can't you be more specific? Can't you give us a prompt? Can't you tell us, one specific question to answer in doing the paper? And I keep on attempting to get you to think as openly as you can about what I've said up to the point of the end of the next class, and write your essay on a specific issue that you find to be the most interesting about it all. So Any of you can do that. Okay, that's the initial prompt, which some people find not to be specific enough. But that's what I would like you to do. But for those of you who want a more specific prompt, what you could do is you could just pick any one of, say, the top 3 or 4 major points that have been made in the first 6 lectures, counting the one on Thursday. To pick any of the 3 major points you think I'm driving at in the course, and then you can tell me, you can explain whether or not you agree with or disagree with the point that I'm making, and then explain why you agree with it or disagree with it. And you should do so with reference to the materials in the lecture and the readings. And there is additional credit given for the use of the readings. So that it's not just a course where you just come and listen to the lectures and then kind of feed back to me what it is I've said, because anybody can do that if you can remember. But I want you to be thinking about the things that we're saying here, and telling me whether you agree or disagree with them and why, with reference to the readings. Okay, so that's a more specific prompt, Andrew.
Just to clarify, it's due this Thursday or next week?
No, it's not due until next week. Do it. Hand in the papers on Monday, because I want you to have the whole weekend to work on them, but I don't want the paper to carry through on into Monday, so that you're busting your chops, Monday trying to get it done and not reading the stuff for the Tuesday's class. So just send it in on. You do it electronically, right? Yeah, and just send it in to Noah. His email is right here on the syllabus. So I just want you to finish it by Monday at, say, 10 o'clock, okay? And get it to him, because I want you to be able to have the additional value of the weekend to take the time to write a thoughtful essay, okay? As I said, this isn't a torture chamber, and it's not an attempt just to impose pain and suffering on you. I want you to think reflectively about the nature of what we're talking about here, because you can see not only from the seriousness of the information that we're talking about in the course of the lecture, but also these major issues. That this course is an attempt to provide to you an actual basis for political science, to really understand what the science is behind these different political worldviews that come to bear, and that you will see the key question. You hear me repeat it in the lecture on Thursday, and that is that the key to understand is that nobody knows the definitive answer to any of these questions yet. And so everybody is entitled to come to these particular conclusions. The only question is whether you think consistently and coherently. And so that's the key to the thing, is that people don't know the answers to these questions. They're probing to get the answers to these questions. But you happen to be blessed by living in perhaps one of the last generations of our human family that won't know the definitive answer to these questions. Because once they start getting the definitive answers to these questions, there's going to be a great tendency to gravitate all to one particular worldview. And that's going to take on the dangers of uniformity, and that there's sort of a pressure on you to conform to a particular worldview and to have a particular set of beliefs in response to the answers to all these questions. So you are one of the last free generations that get to inquire into these questions and explore the different worldviews objectively and tell me what you think about them. Okay? And you can include this as one of the subject matters of your paper, if you want, is what do you think of these worldviews? And what do you think about the predicates, the underlying predicates of the worldviews, which you'll hear about in more detail in the video on Thursday. And then Noah will help lead the discussion with you on Thursday after class, where you can rattle your ideas around with each other, because you'll be thinking about your papers by that time, not having to have to hand them in, but you'll be thinking seriously about what you want to say, and you can ask each other questions about this, okay? All right? Terrific. Thank you, kids. Thank you.
I have more syllabi if anyone needs more.